is a really good opportunity to introduce the panel. So Brody Albert is an art professor here at Chaffey. Mark Ikeda is Emeritus Professor of Biology at San Bernardino Valley College and a Chaffey alum. Ryan Falcioni is also a Chaffey alum and is a philosophy professor here at Chaffey. Sergio Gomez is a sociology professor at Chaffey. And Ann Kaneko, filmmaker, scripts professor, is on the freeway as we speak. and she'll be coming in. She actually, and I know that one of the things she's going to be showing is a trailer for her, I think Emmy Emmy award-winning short documentary, Manzanar Diverted, When Water Becomes Dust. And I'm Robin Ikeda, the moderator and Emerita Professor of Biology at Chaffey. Emerita means retired and engaged. And so you're here at this panel discussion titled, Am I? Am I? Unveiling the Illusion of Individuality. And this discussion is inspired by the art exhibition up at the museum right now, titled Seeing the Unseen, exploring the intersections of science and art. And the panel thought I should give a little spiel, and I'll try to make it very little, about how this question, am I, originated from this art. And so here's the deal, right? So in last spring and in the summer, I'm on a team of people who is vetting 55 artists to be represented in this exhibition. And as I'm going through the art, I'm noticing that, to my surprise, because I'm a scientist, I'm not used to looking at art, unfortunately. I mean, but anyway, so I notice that a lot of these artists, most of these artists, are working right in the middle of a question that has perplexed me for almost 50 years since I was a student at Chaffey, and hits you whenever you scratch the surface to try to think deeply about biological systems. So let's take sponges, for example. We have the most magnificent photograph here of a huge variety of sponges, all growing in one place. And we think we can see the difference between the individual sponges. And we think that each of those individual sponges is in fact I even say it that way. Our language is built this way, to suppose that we know the boundaries of individuals. The way these sponges work, so for example, this guy, right? It's basically, they're all animals for one, and so one weird thing is that they don't move around, but they're pumps, and they pump water through them, and then they catch all of the algae, bacteria, different kinds of small critters that come through, and they eat them. They digest them. And they use, that material to maintain life and to reproduce. They reproduce sexually. They can make sperm and eggs. And what's really kind of fancy about these guys is that they can even make sperm and eggs. So each, individual can make both sperm and eggs, which is, fancy for us. And they can also reproduce asexually. So, for example, this is kind of cool. See how this one looks like it's kind of broken? Well, maybe a sea turtle came and munched on it, but maybe it got chipped off by a rock or something. And that little chip can just go float around, settle, and become a sponge. Whatever a sponge is. And by the way, you could take a sponge, right, put it through a sieve, separate it, the cells, and it'll self-assemble into a working sponge again. So what is a sponge? And then furthermore, right, those algae that it eats, how come these guys are so colorful, right? Because they're taking in, right, the algae that they've, quote unquote, eaten, and some of it they digest and use it to make more sponges, but some of that algae will live inside of their cells, between their cells, and do photosynthesis, and make up as much as 80% of the sponge's metabolic needs. So what's the sponge? And then even then, right, like down here, you see how it looks like the same kind of sponge, but there's two different colors, right? Okay, so two different kinds of algae, that's what that's about, with different pigments doing photosynthesis. And you know what I said about fragmentation and they can settle? Fragments from quote-unquote different sponges, like genetically different sponges, right, can settle and become part of the same sponge. So see, even the way language is built makes me beg the question, right? Different sponges, the same sponge. I don't know what a sponge is. And if I'm a sponge, I don't know what myself is. I'm having a huge identity crisis right now if I'm any one of these guys. So just saying. Well, and it's just like, well, those are sponges. It's just like, come on, I'm a human. I don't like sponges. Okay, so I'm Robin Ikeda. You think you're looking at Robin Ikeda. I think I'm Robin Ikeda. And you could ask me, well, who do you think Robin Ikeda is, right? And it's just like, well, I don't mean to get personal, right? But there was a sperm and there was an egg, and they got together, and that's me. The rest is history, right? Well, that cell, right, that fertilized, embryo, that's only about, cells that originated from that cell are only about 10 to 30%. 10 to 30% of what you see here, right? And, okay, but what about the DNA? There was DNA in those cells, and that's what made you, right? It's less than 1% of all the DNA in all of, wherever the boundary of this is. And speaking of boundaries, right, the rest is microorganisms. The rest is fungi and bacteria and viruses. And so back to the art that's in Seeing the Unseen, one of the artists. This is my gateway artwork right here. This was my way in. It's just like, when I read about this art and I understood this art, it was just like, I get it, at least at one level. One of Luisa's students last week schooled me on a whole other level of getting it. That was awesome. So anyway, David Goodsell, right, paints what he calls molecular landscapes. And these are too small to see with even a microscope. We don't have the optical equipment to see these things, so he's making them based on scientific references that he cites. Okay, various scientific data, various chemical data, and so what we have here is droplets that. This is a respiratory droplet, so these are the larger of a host of materials that my respiratory system is projecting into this room. We have lots of filters going, but I see some of you wearing masks, and with this many people in the room, if I wasn't speaking, I'd probably be wearing a mask too, right? But the science shows that the filtration is effective. So there is that point. And I'm making that point because we've learned in the pandemic that we share intimate details of our insides with each other without knowing it, right? And so the aerosols that I'm making are a little bit smaller than these droplets, okay, but they have all the same stuff. Surfactant, which keeps my lungs from collapsing, mucus, right? And Brody's really kind of getting a lot, and so is Marky right now. And mucus, a whole bunch of immune cells, and then there's a COVID virus that he's put inside of it too, right? And so we've learned in spades in the last few years how interconnected we are and how interdependent we are and how much, even where we breathe, where we sing, and these exchanges have been going on since we took our first breath. They've been going on since before we were born. So we're going to explore these questions together. What is the self? What is an individual? Why does it matter, right? And you've been introduced to the panelist. You're a participant, right? And so the first thing to do is, on whatever you have to take notes on, maybe you're going to do it in the note app on your phone, or maybe you have pencil and paper. But what we'd like you to do is take a moment to consider, what do you think self is? What do you think an individual is? Because that's what each of these panelists is going to do. Each of these panelists is going to address these questions from their perspective, as a philosopher, as a biologist, as an artist, as a filmmaker, as a sociologist, okay? And so you first, yeah? Take a moment, and then after every presentation, you're going to be revisiting your notes. What do you think is an individual? Why does it matter? You're going to be revisiting your thoughts, maybe pair sharing, right? Chit-chatting about it a little bit. You'll have to be quick. You'll get a minute or two, and then on to the next one, right? And then you'll be ready for the panel discussion because you'll have lots of questions. I'm going to be quiet, right? Take a moment. And it's really important to write it down, right? So if you don't have anything to write with, just get out your phone, use the note app, or wherever you like to take notes on your phone. And you might chit-chat. You're probably sitting next to somebody that you know. If that'll get the juices flowing, it's just like, I don't know, I never think about this. I was watching some of you guys and just kind of channeling my former self, sitting there, like going, this is very confusing. I don't want to write something dumb. It's just like, there's no such thing. We're all confused. It's all dumb. Yeah, right.
Okay. Thank you for your work, Stan.
It's time for Brody.
Yeah, okay, cool. Hi, everyone. I'm an artist, so I had to think about this through the framework of art, through the lens of art. It was an interesting thing. So first of all, thank you, Robin, for putting this together, for organizing this, for the lovely conversations that this has made. Thank you, Rebecca, for making, with the faculty, an incredible exhibition. If you haven't seen it, go see it. It's really, really, really killer. It's really, really good. So the kind of proposition here is, what is self? What is an individual? And how do our respective fields understand those concepts? So I'm going to make a case through art. By the way, there's like 100 ways that I could have approached this, right? Art is this really amazing thing where it's kind of a container that can hold all sorts of different interests. And that's why I chose to pursue it, because anything that I'm interested in, I can kind of point it and put it in there and think about it through artistic terms. But I'm going to make a case that the individual, the self, is always relational. It's always in relationship to something else, to what it is not. So in that sense, it's always about drawing a boundary, drawing a border. And I want to talk about that through some ideas of design principles, some ideas of how we see, and I want to look at it art historically a little bit. So this image right here is going to be the guiding principle for the next few slides that we look at. This was an image that was made over 100 years ago in the Bauhaus, an experimental school in Germany that really has revolutionized things. I'm apologizing to my students because they're sick of hearing me talk about the Bauhaus. I'm sorry, guys, but still, it's how we think and how we teach arts education. So this was an early experiment in photography, and they were just experimenting with double exposure. So here we have a figure right now that is dissolving into its background. Right? And you can see very clearly how it works, that there is a photograph of a chair, that camera did not move, it was exposed again while someone was sitting in that chair. When those two operations add up, we get this ghostly spectral figure where the background and the subject are starting to become one. That's what I want to get at. That's what I want to talk about. But before we even get there, I want to just kind of make it clear that making art is super weird. It's a strange thing that we do as humans that we've been doing for a very long time. And intrinsic to the act of making art is a definition of self and other. Anytime that you make a work of art, really make anything, you are taking something internal to yourself and you are externalizing it in the world. I had this idea. Here is an image that I have in my mind's eye, and now I am putting it out in the world. By doing that, you are separating yourself from the world. You are demarcating things. So here's an image of the Chauvet Caves in south of France that was made 36,000 years ago. 36,000 years ago. And here are these artists, one or many artists, literally signing the walls, externalizing their bodies, putting the handprint on the wall and leaving the mark. And just by doing that, they're making a separation between self and other. So making art is a weird proposition. And there's intrinsically something kind of philosophical and profound to when we make a thing and externalize it to ourselves, which also brings up the weird idea of self-portraiture. In many ways, every work of art is a self-portrait. Every work of art is a representation of self. So I want to linger on a few ideas when we talk about this, because there's a few things that are just built into the way that we think about things that I think is pretty fascinating. One is simply the naming convention of art. Have you ever thought about this? It's really strange, right? Like I would say this is a Van Gogh. That's not Van Gogh, but it's a Van Gogh. It's a Picasso. It's a Matisse. So even built into the way that we discuss art, there's this kind of genetic relationship. It's as if it's the child of the person that made the thing, as if it really has this relationship, as if it's part of the individual artist themselves, but now separate from that artist. Wow, that's really weird. That makes me want to like cry a little bit. Like it's a very, very confusing proposition. In the Renaissance, in the Italian Renaissance, they had this beautiful phrase. They said that art was the grandchild of God. Art is the grandchild of God. And it actually comes from some journals by Leonardo. Leonardo was writing about painting, and he said that that nature is the child of God. Therefore, when we paint nature, we are painting its grandchild. And in that way, every work of art is the grandchild of God. So I think there's some relationship there when we think about the individual externalizing themselves, how a little bit of them is still there. When we talk about sharing our COVID germs and our aerosols, there's something even in that rhymes with this weird condition of what it is to make art. So that's just the kind of like groundwork. That's like a very, very strange idea. But I want to step back 1 second and talk about how we teach art in the very introductory phases of teaching art. We teach these principles of perception. And I think they are intrinsically philosophical. And I don't think we take enough time to step back and really ponder what the philosophical impacts of them are. Now I realize there's an actual philosopher sitting next to me, so I better be careful about how I throw that word around, but I think it'll be okay. I'll get away with it. I won't lose my job yet. We'll wait for that. So we teach these ideas through the science of perception, and a lot of it comes from something called Gestalt psychology. Gestalt psychology was an early 20th century formulation of psychological principles that are all based on perception, how we see the world, how we perceive the world, how our senses work, and how that shapes the reality that we live in. One of the principles of Gestalt psychology is called figure-ground relationship. And when we teach art early on, we're all about figure-ground relationship. We're teaching it as something to utilize to make strong designs. So right now, I'm not gonna play around. Right now, I think that we should think that figure-ground relationship is a metaphor for self and other. The figure is the self, the ground is the other. And what the Gestalt principle of figure-ground relationship says is that our brains have a very difficult time of holding both the background and the foreground together at once. So if you look at this image, we've all seen this image, right? But when you look at this image, something very strange happens. Your brain should be flipping. So at one moment, we can see the white as a vase, right? We can see it as some kind of form, and then the black becomes the background. And then instantaneously, you look at the black becomes the foreground. The black becomes the figure, the white becomes the background. And if you just kind of like feel yourself looking at these, I think you'll feel that it's almost impossible to look at both the figure and the ground at the same time. Wow, that's very strange to me. And I think that has all sorts of implications. It has philosophical implications, spiritual implications, but it also has environmental implications. It has all sorts of implications, that this is the framework in which we have developed as people. Oh, there's a lot of problems. There's a lot of problems. Thank you. Excellent timing. Okay, so figure ground relationship is like the bread and butter of graphic design, right? It's like when people design logos, they're playing around with figure ground relationship, and it's the way that they communicate meaning. So maybe we've all seen this, but the FedEx logo is the FedEx logo until you look at the white arrow between the E and the X, which comes forward. So here are designers being clever. They're being clever. They're not being philosophical, but they're being clever. And they're using the negative space, the background, the figure ground relationship as a way of conveying meaning. When we teach painting, we teach artists to control the figure ground relationship. And I want to kind of pick that apart a little bit too, because I think there's some implications in that. So this is a painting by N.C. Wyeth, an 18th century illustrator. This is from the books, the Treasure Island books that are about pirates. But if we look at this image, it has a very, what I'm gonna say, clear figure ground relationship, right? You can clearly see the figure in relationship to the ground. Squint at the image. If we all squint at the image, what you should see is the values break down and you just see a black silhouette of the figure and the white background. It's a trick that we artists use, right? We squint at things in order to break them down to their essential components. So when I squint, I lose all information and I only see the background and I only see the figure, and there's no confusing those two things. So here's N.C. Wyeth, right? Painting pictures of pirates. And what he's painting is a picture of a human being from a very colonial perspective that has dominion over the earth. This is a person that is not part of the land, but is separate from the land, that is controlling the land. So even baked into this very simple principle of how we paint clear figures, of how we paint clear figure ground relationships, is a political dimension. And we're taught that this is proper painting. This is what you do. This is how you paint well. I think it's worth stepping back and asking what happens if we do it wrong. What happens if we make an ambiguous figure? This is a painting by a guy named Nathan Oliveira, who's a Bay Area figurative artist making work in the 40s and 50s. And he made all sorts of paintings that have very ambiguous figure ground relationships, where the figure is just emerging from the atmosphere that it exists in. Here, our brains have an easier time taking in the background and the foreground at the same time. So if this image is about the separation from the environment, about domination of the environment, then it makes me ask, what is this image about? What is this image about? Very interesting ideas to me. Okay, we know why we see figure ground relationship, right? We know why it is necessary. It is necessary because if we do not see figure ground relationship, that thing's gonna eat you, right? We need to be able to see, just as a survival tactic, the evolutionary pressures have forced us to be able to separate the lion from the savannah, right? We need to be able to, tiger, whatever the hell that thing is. We need to be able to see that thing in relationship to its environment so that we don't get eaten. And this is exactly why a tiger has its stripes. Now all of a sudden there's a philosophical dimension to the simple common idea of camouflage. And our brains are so good, we don't have any problem picking that apart, right? We've kind of developed a way where we can still see the outlines of that figure in relationship to the ground. But this is why a tiger has its stripes. And I want to pause real quick, because here's one of the ways in which camouflage is profound. It talks to the ways in which we are co-created, in the ways in which we are creating each other at any given moment. So the tiger has its stripes because someone is looking at it. We see figure ground relationship because someone is trying to eat us. So it's always in relationship to something. I quite like thinking about the camouflage that zebras have. Because here it kind of changes the game a little bit. The zebra doesn't have its stripes so it can separate itself from its environment. It has its stripes so it can blend in, it can dissolve the figure ground relationship with the other individuals in its group. which, by the way, I don't know if you've ever seen dazzle camouflage that was used in World War II. They used to paint these Navy vessels with things that looked just like zebra stripes in an effort to dissolve the figure-ground relationship. So here it is. We are all co-created. We are all co-creating ourselves at every moment. We are not individuals that exist alone. We are individuals that exist in relationship to something else. I had to show this painting. This is like the coolest painting ever. This is by a mid-century illustrator named Charlie Harper. And Charlie Harper clearly understands what's going on with the zebra stripes, right? But also, I needed to share this painting because it has the best title ever. This painting is called Serengeti Spaghetti. That's it. That's the whole reason I'm up here, is just to say Serengeti Spaghetti, because that's like a really, really good title. Let's look at a few artists. We're gonna look at 3 artists, right? So let's look at a few artists that make meaning of the figure-ground relationship, that understand how figure-ground relationship works, and then make some kind of impactful statement based on that. So this is a series of photographs by a woman named Carrie Mae Weems, brilliant photographer that's still working today. Carrie Mae Weems made these photographs that have very pronounced figure-ground relationships. She is a black woman, dressed in all black, taking a photograph of herself against a white background. So it might be the white background of suburbia, or the white background of Rome, the seed of Western civilization. It might be the white background of the art institutions that tell us what has intrinsic value and what does not. So she is saying, here I am, a black woman, a figure to the ground. What does my black body have to do with this white ground? I stand in contrast and in defiance to the figure-ground relationship. Powerful. Amazing. We can utilize these things to make meaning, and we are taught culturally to decipher meaning from these things as well. I think this image really sums it up, right? There's nothing more powerful than this image. So here she is, in contrast to the institutions of power. Here she is, a black body, surrendering herself to the white noise that surrounds her. Now, studied viewers of art history will understand that there's another dimension to this image, that embedded in this image is this image, Wanderer Above Sea and Fog, by a German Romanticist painter named Caspar David Friedrich. And this image is, by the way, embedded in culture so deeply. We see this in 1,000 video games and 1,000 movies. We have taught how to see the world through this image. And this image was used to discuss ideas of the sublime, of the overpowering power of nature. So it's always about the figure in relationship to nature. So anyway, I think you can see very clearly how this image has this image embedded into it. So an artist that's utilizing figure-ground relationship and drawing sharp contrasts. We also have an artist that's doing the opposite. This is a room that you can walk into. This is an installation by a guy named James Turrell, who's a light and space artist. When you walk into this room, you lose all sense of figure and ground. All you are is this floating perception. The corners have been softened. You are either in a room that's 5 by 5 feet or 500 by 500 feet. All sense of relationality has been lost. Of course, until someone else walks into the room, right? And then again, we have a figure-ground relationship. It is such an interesting experience to be in these rooms. Your body becomes alien to itself. When you look at your hands, it's as if you were looking out and seeing your hands from another body, because we have no grounding. There are no hard edges here. So here's an artist that's doing the opposite of Carrie Mae Weems, that's making philosophical impact by dissolving the figure-ground relationship. The background becomes foreground, the foreground becomes background. Beautiful. I want to end on this artist. This may be my favorite artist of all time. This is an artwork by a guy named Felix Gonzalez Torres. Simply a pile of candy in the room. And I thought it'd be interesting to end on this artist in the way that this conversation was framed and actually kind of started, was through Robin's observation about the pandemic, about how the pandemic highlighted how we are all in this together. This is art that was made during another pandemic, another epidemic, the AIDS crisis. Felix Gonzalez Torres is a Cuban-American artist, was a Cuban-American artist, a gay man, had a partner before marriage was legal, and he was this brilliant minimalist conceptual artist. And he got known for these candy piles. Candy piles just exist in the museum. You walk into the museum and you are actually encouraged to take one of these pieces of candy. You are encouraged to take a candy, eat the candy, go about your day, and enjoy the rest of the time. Then you read the title of these, and you see that they're actually named after a person. They're all titled, untitled, parentheses, Ross. Ross was Felix Gonzalez Torres's partner, who, at this time, was battling AIDS. So if we think about this, here's a minimalist sculpture, a body in the room, that is dissolving by people taking part in it. Each candy pile is actually measured out to the weight, the ideal weight of Ross. So it would be 150 pounds of candy piled into the corner. Every day, that body would dissolve slowly, and the museum would replenish it. And it brings up these really powerful ideas about self and other. I imagine being in New York at this time and seeing this and taking the subway home and looking at the people around me and thinking, did you have some of that candy? Did you have some of that candy? Where is that sugar located now? How is it distributed across a population? It is such a ripe, powerful metaphor where by taking a pleasurable act, enjoying the candy, we are participating in the dissolving of this figure. It is one of the most powerful artworks that I can possibly imagine. So here's Felix Gonzalez Torres inviting you to take a little bit of candy, enjoy that, but also ponder what the edges of your own body are and how it dissolves and how it ends. That's it. Thank you.
Take a minute, literally a minute, and think, pause, revise, reflect, note, and if you have any questions to ask Brody or anything, even if it isn't anything you're curious about, even if it isn't as coherent as a question, go ahead and make note of that and chat and stretch if you need to also. All right, next up. Got the mic, got the clicker. All right.
I don't think I've ever given a lecture sitting down, so I'm not going to start now.
I was wondering.
So I see the world as an ant colony. That's a professional liability that I carry. And one of the descriptions of these ant colonies are superorganisms. So I'd like you to take a moment and think about what that means and think about what connotations that has for humanity and the world. So the starting point for this little exercise is a leafcutter ant queen, and I chose her because of all the components of the colony. She represents, as best I can tell, the starting point. And so that's what she looks like with her wings on. She carries within her the sperm that's been donated by 3 to 5 males and about 2 to 3 million sperm from those males. And she has an estimated lifespan of about 10 to 15 years, depending upon who you talk to. And what you see, on the left-hand margin there is a representation about the leafcutter queen's activities. Once she gets started, she, first of all, drops her wings, and secondly, constructs a tunnel down into this chamber at the bottom. And the white mass that you see next to the figure that's representing the de-elated queen is a fungal mass that she carried with her in her mouth parts that is starting to grow as she tends them. And this is about it for the queen. This is about as autonomous as the queen ever gets. And the gradual life cycle of the entire colony kind of represents the autonomy that's given up by the queen. At this point in time, the queen has the capability of managing the fungal food pile that she'll be eating off of. And at this point in time, she also has the capacity to lay eggs, take care of those eggs, and take care of the workers that will come from those eggs. So she is what I would recognize as an individual, as something or somebody that's autonomous. The eggs that are laid by the queen go through a typical insect progression from egg to larvae to pupa and adult. And so most insects go through that sort of metamorphosis, and that's true of the ants as well. At the end of this metamorphosis, the adult stage is represented by physical casts. That's the term that myrmecologists use to describe these adults. And what I want to conflate here or get rid of here is a bias that you may think, well, there's a baby adult and this is the bigger adult that the baby grows into. Now, these are all adults. They represent final end stages of these lines that are being determined by certain characteristics of the eggs that were laid by the queen. So they represent distinct physical entities. And the queen produced them all, but they look very different from one another. They're all female, by the way, and they're all sterile. They don't reproduce. All they do is contribute to the functioning of the colony. And each of these castes, each of these different types of adults have slightly different functions in association with the colony. So the largest one here is a soldier. Again, a name that we gave to that caste to talk about the defensive properties of that particular adult. The smaller ones are referred to as minims because of their size. If we look at the tasks that they're involved in, they take care of the eggs, they take care of the fungus, and they take care of many other activities, getting rid of trash, getting rid of dead bodies that are part of being in the ant colony. And the last thing to say is that as these workers, as these castes age, their behaviors also change as a function of age. So if we look at some of the largest workers here, they not only have this defensive function associated with them, but they have the tremendous function of bringing food into the ant colony. And to do that, the food that you'll be seeing them gather are leaf fragments that are brought into the ant colony. They do that by cutting leaves up into little pieces and transporting those pieces of leaves into the ant colony. And as they're performing this cutting activity, their mandibles become dull. They become much less efficient at cutting the leaves. In fact, in the oldest ones that are leaf cutters, they're only half as efficient when they reach a certain age than they were when they started out doing that activity. But it takes them twice as long to cut the leaf fragments. So there's this trade-off. There's this point in time where those ants that used to be good at leaf cutting are no longer efficient. And they'll transition to a second behavior of just carrying the leaf fragments back to the colony instead of being responsible for cutting the leaf fragments. So we call that age polyethism. Polyethism means different behaviors. Age is what the variable is that produces those differences in behavior. Okay, somebody got curious about what these ant colonies look like in their extent when they reach maturation. And this particular leafcutter ant colony was found in an old cow pasture somewhere in Central America. The colony itself had been abandoned for many years, and they decided to haul out a concrete truck and fill up the tunnels with concrete and try and excavate the extent of that leafcutter colony. These are people down here. Those aren't ants. And this is the extent of the colony that they excavated during that process. There's a backhoe off camera that helped them dig the hole because they had no idea how large this ant colony was. What we're seeing there is the production of about 5 to 8 million individual workers that existed in that ant colony producing that structure. Nobody was in control. That's something that they did as an aggregate. And the last slide is this one. I talked about the leafcutter ants bringing leaf fragments into the colony. There you get a nice view of the workers carrying the leaf fragments. Here are the workers disassembling a leaf. And here are the leaf fragments that have been piled together inside the ant colony. That mass, that fungal mass, is grown off of these leaf fragments. If you know something about sourdough bread, you always have this starter that you need to make the bread. That's the starter for the ant colonies. It's basically the fungus. The ants don't eat the leaves directly. What they do is grow fungus on the leaf fragments that have been mulched, and on the fungus there are small bumps and small fruiting bodies that the ants actually consume as food. So the leaf fragments come into the colony, they're munched up, they are implanted with fungus, and the products of that fungus are in essence what the leafcutter ants are now consuming. Well, what's the queen doing in all this? Isn't she in charge? That queen designation is a biased designation. She is in some chamber being fed with these fungal food products by workers. She no longer goes around inside the colony. She is sequestered in a single chamber for the rest of her life. And like I said, that's like 10 to 15 years. Underground, in the dark, being fed by workers. She no longer has the capacity to move around. She no longer has the capacity to dispose of her waste. That's all done by workers. So it seems to me this entire subject of looking at a leaf cutter ant queen is the process of giving up autonomy. She used to be able to do everything, and in the final moments of her life, she can do absolutely one thing: produce eggs. So when we talk about a superorganism, what we're seeing in this case, using a biological lens, is something that biologists like to call the ancillary gut. Think of your stomach as being represented by this fungus pile. Think of the activities of your stomach helping to nourish you in the same way these ants are using the fungus pile to nourish the entire colony. So whatever an ant colony is, it's a colony of ants, but those ants are totally dependent upon one another. If you take a worker out of the colony, the worker has no capacity to reproduce. It has barely enough capacity to gather a leaf fragment, but then it doesn't have the capacity to grow fungus on that leaf fragment. So the worker starves to death. If you do the same similar action to the queen, take her out of the colony, she doesn't know how to feed herself anymore. She can't defend herself anymore. So she no longer represents this idea of an autonomous entity. So in my mind, that kind of is another piece of evidence that takes this idea of an individual and kind of disassembles that idea or obscures that idea. The last thing that I'd like you to think about in looking at a leafcutter colony is to think about humans and the humans' relationship to Earth. And thinking about the leafcutter ant colony as a metaphor. I think the fungal pile that the leafcutter ants rely upon for us is the earth. We can't exist without it. There isn't anything that we can do to replicate an earth that's going to help nourish us. And yet, we take it for granted that it's always going to be there, just like the ants do in the leafcutter ant colony. And we don't know much about how it operates. All we know is that the fungal pile provides food for us. And all we know is that the earth provides us with food, housing, our total place in the universe. So I think that's it for me.
Just take a minute and think and revise. It turns out that if you're writing, ignore me. But it turns out that if we revisit our thinking from time to time and reflect with new knowledge and integrate that before we take on more new knowledge, more perspective, it's called the metacognitive cycle. It's important enough there's a name for it. So we're sort of like embedding that. All right, Ryan Falcioni.
Thanks, Robin. Yeah, thank you to Rebecca, Robin, and the panelists for putting this together. It should be fun, and again, not to pressure you, but I think usually the Q&A is the best part of this stuff. So this first question, which I think we've had some really good light shed on it already, is really, what is the individual or self, right? What are we talking about here when we say, there's something called individuality, whether it's a myth or a fiction or illusion or not, and what is a self, whether that's real or not, or fiction or illusion. And the difficulty is there's no agreement on what these terms mean, right? Think about just the difference in different disciplines, right? How you would understand what an individual something is, right? Every discipline kind of has its own perspective. Like the ant question is interesting, right? We ask, what's going on there? What are the individual parts of that reality? Is it the individual ants? Is it the ant colony? Is it the broader ecosystem it's a part of? Is it the universe? And all the way down to, I can imagine a physicist looking at the particles and interactions involved, or the chemist looking at the chemical reactions, interactions involved. And so if we think of the different disciplines having a bit of a different interest in those things, so do different philosophers and philosophies, right? What's an individual? How do we carve up the world? What components matter? And there's always an ethical implication to that, right? How I carve up the world says a lot about what I value. And in fact, I had a philosopher say this once of kind of how you carve up the world, what's real, what's not, what's an individual or not, says a lot more about you than it does about the world, right? In doing that, I mean, for better or for worse, is always exclusionary. Right? Once we say what an individual is, or if we're thinking more about now persons or beings that are selves, what selves are, it's always exclusionary. Right? This is actually a really big point in feminist theory. I was just reading something the other day. It said the act of describing a self is always exclusionary. Because some people count, or some things count, and some don't. Right? And historically, that's been used for all sorts of malevolent purposes, right? And so this issue now of what counts as an individual, there's kind of a interdisciplinary question, individual what, right? We're not talking about just persons here, but just what constitutes reality, what are the part-whole relationships, and we can ask that a million different ways to get a million different answers. And then the more interesting question I think we're all getting at here is what is our role in that, or what are selves? And I think selves here, we mean something like a being or a thing, right? It could be an individual thing that is self-aware, or that it matters to them how things go for them, has interests. I might even say ego, but I want to avoid that here. But a self is something that has an awareness of their being and some awareness of their interests or goals or whatever. And so again, I don't have a good answer for exactly who or what counts there. I think kind of the battleground right now seems to be what to do with various animals and even ecosystems. Can an ecosystem be a self? Can it matter for an ecosystem how it goes for that ecosystem? Do they have interests that should matter, right, ethically? Individual animals. And so I'm just throwing that out there. I have a view, which may come up if you ask me. I won't address that right now. But I think that's pretty interesting. So again, there's philosophical, scientific, religious, ethical dimensions. We touched on a few. I'm going to hone in on this sort of more philosophical debate, and that'll be the second slide in just a minute here. But the big question in the history of philosophy has been, right, really, is there a self? And if so, what is it, where is it, et cetera? In fact, I almost did a slide where I said, is there a physical or a metaphysical self? And then I had the second slide and say, no, discussion over. Like, right? There is no substantive self. You can't put a finger on what a self is, or even what an individual is. These are both conceptual. But what a self is, right? You can't say that there's the self. It's the brain, or it's in the brain, and you've seen probably, if you know a bit about the history of pseudoscience, many interesting pseudoscientific forays into finding the self. The whole 21 grams experiment, right, 100-something years ago, weighing bodies as they die on this very delicate scale, and then assessing based on how much lighter they got at death, how much the soul weighed. And that's where you probably heard that. There's like a movie about that, I think, right? 21 grams. Pretty bizarre. By the way, even that study kind of highlights some of these intersections of these definitions and concepts, because the study, I think, involved 6 humans and then tons of dogs. And the dogs, by the way, to be weighed and sedated the way they were arguably either poisoned or sabotaged in some way. So it's interesting. And the goal there was to even show that humans have souls and dogs don't. Right? First of all, what a weird experiment to think that it's been replicated. People keep trying to do this, right? Like now these super sensitive scales, and you can capture the soul, which again would be the seed of the self, or maybe the self itself. But even in that, you see the speciesism. Dogs don't count as selves, so they can be whatever, ultimately tortured into being weighed upon death, because they're not selves. Even the experiment to find where the self is, in some ways what the self is, there's already a decision made that dogs aren't selves. We don't care about their interests or if it matters for them how life goes for them, right? So anyway, that's just a little highlight of sort of the intersectionality there. And then this third point here, really about, well, then what is it? When we talk about a self, or even just an individual, we're thinking more broadly, we're carving up reality into individual units and this part-whole relationship. What are we doing? And I want to introduce or invite you to consider, better way to say it, the reality that all of these definitions and explanations and the experiments and stories we tell about them, they're stories. Right, there's a journalist, I think he's an English professor, Jonathan Gottschall, who says, humans are the original storytellers, and we're invariably storytellers. We're homo fictus, right? Homo fictus. Not homo sapiens, homo fictus. We're humans because we tell stories. That's what we do. And the first story is the story of a self. So many neuroscientists and evolutionary psychologists have gotten into this work, that it seems that at some point it served our interests, at least some humans' interests, to tell the story that there was a self, right? That if you believe there's a self and an ego, you have an interest in protecting that. And so that at some point it served a net reproductive advantage to tell this story, which is a story, it's an illusion, that I'm a self independent from others. Sometimes even my own kin, right? That I'm separate from, and in some ways I matter more. And if you want to get really afield, which we can talk about in the discussion, you can kind of draw a line from that original story to pretty much all of the enterprises of ego, whether it's imperialism, capitalism, right, colonialism, right? If I'm a self and my interests matter, and I'm a better, bigger self, the more I can accumulate or the more I can accomplish, right? It seems that myth, that original story might be quite pernicious, or at least ethically problematic. And then again, all our stories stem from there. So it's kind of 2 layers to this homo fictus, right? The original story of a self. There might be prior stories for earlier or human ancestors, but at some point, this story entered into the human sphere. We are selves, we have interests, and we value those, and generally over and above others, hence this survival piece of it. And then we tell ourselves a million other stories to rationalize that or to support that and the endeavors that stem from there. So leaving that on hold for a second, this final point, which is really the next slide, is I want to invite you to consider this more ethical dimension of how we understand the self, and the value of self seems to be very ethically significant. There's like an irreducibility of the ethical here, right? How we understand ourselves, or what a self is, I think has these ethical connotations and can be one of the more important and rich discussions to be had here. So I'm trying to draw a contrast. I initially had different thinkers. I had like Ayn Rand and some non-dualist thinkers that were contemporary. And I kind of landed on this because it's a great one for the class of history of philosophy, right? Kind of Eastern, Western, these classical stories in some ways of self, or about self, I should say. So many of you probably have heard of Descartes. He's a late 16th, mostly 17th century philosopher, one of the founders of kind of the Enlightenment. And for him, the self is really the only undoubtable reality there is. Right? He says, you can doubt everything else. Some of you know the cogitos. Cogito ergo sum, which I think, therefore I am. You probably all heard that. Why does he say that? Well, he says, the one thing you can never doubt is that there's a self. Because even if you're doubting that there is a self, or you're doubting that there is reality, there's something doing the doubting, and that's self. Right? It's a founding myth of modern Western civilization here, right? This idea that there's a self, and that you can't doubt. And much of the history of enlightenment builds upon that initial myth or story. There's a self, right? Then from here you get notions of property rights and all sorts of other things that come along with this notion of self. And again, drawing that line from there to many of the imperialist and colonialist endeavors and other things, sexism, racism, et cetera, in the West, right? There's a self, and that matters the most because it's the most certain thing, and everything we know builds from there. And everything that's valued is built from there, right? And there's a lot I could say about that. I'll leave that on hold. Contrast that with these ideas from the Buddha and traditional Buddhism, in both traditions, if we're not going to get into that right now, but the contrasting Descartes' notion here with the Buddha's notion of no self, right? Which I'll get into that a little bit here. But anatman or anatta, which means that this is the founding, not just the founding myth, but the myth that leads to all suffering and ultimately all evil in the world. Right? The whole goal of Buddhism is to get rid of self, to deny there is an ego, to get rid of ego because then you get rid of desire, which then involves a cessation of suffering. If you know the Four Noble Truths, there's kind of a progression there, right? You see the cause of suffering, ultimately see there's a solution. It involves recognizing there is no ego, there is no self. It's an illusion, as Mark was getting at, I think Brody too. It's an illusion, it's a construction, but it's a false one, and a one that leads to great suffering. And so meditating upon that and coming to realize there is no substantive self is necessary for any notion of happiness. In fact, there's a story, I read it a while ago, I think it's apocryphal, meaning probably not true, but it's attributed to the Buddha, where someone comes to the Buddha and says, I don't know, he says, hey Buddha, but whatever you say to the Buddha, hey Buddha, your Buddhahood, I want happiness, right? And the Buddha says, well, you're close. You just got to get rid of two things. I, because that's ego, that's self. Want, that's desire. And then what are you left with? Happiness. Right? But it's almost impossible to do that, right? For many of us, and again, this is this big contrast between Eastern and Western philosophy here, but that is getting rid of both seems to be near to impossible in a culture in which egoism prevails. I mean, if I had to capture the American ethos, I would say egoism, right? Egoism. Maybe in this term of ethical egoism, if you know Ayn Rand and some of these theories, this idea of you have a duty to pursue your own self-interest. That's the highest moral duty, to maximize the good that can come to you. And you switch to Buddha, and he says that's the biggest lie and the biggest illusion that's at the source of all suffering in the world. The very ethos, right? The very ethic, the very kind of mantra of our morality. And again, I'm not necessarily citing here. I think I have criticisms of egoism that are emerging. But another concept, praticca samutpada, I can barely say that, don't bust me on my Sanskrit, but it's a notion of dependent arising, right, which is the key concept in Buddhism, that everything is interconnected and that all that we are and all that emerges is kind of ephemeral, right? It's coming and going and we're connected with everything. And the idea that we are an ego simply misunderstands the nature of the creative enterprise. Right? And think of you, right? If I say, let's say we're arguing that you are a self, and this notion would invite you to question, okay, well, how did you come about? How did you become a self? Well, arguably, the variables that determined who you were, as Robin said, were things you probably don't want to think about, like your parents doing what they do to create people. And a million other variables that are completely beyond your control, right? You didn't choose to be born. You didn't choose your race, class, gender. You didn't choose, arguably, most anything that makes you you. Right? And meditating upon that, at least in Buddhism, should change your perspective. Right? And maybe even the notion that there is a you that's a substantive thing. We're constantly in this cycle of creation and regeneration, etc. There's a few elements of that which I can get into, but ultimately I just want you to think about that. I sort of invite you to contemplate these two ways of understanding. And this is just on one topic of what is the self in Eastern Western philosophy, right? We could get into the definitions and all the other stuff we've talked about, but does it make sense to think of there being a substantive self, that's you? And if so, should we prioritize that? Right? Because I'm sort of of two minds here. I think it does make sense to think of us being selves at least as some fiction, that right? Like, I'm connected with my thoughts and feelings and experiences in a way that I'm not with yours. And maybe I feel a certain ownership of that, or that's an identity thing for me. So it makes sense to, in some ways, carve out reality that I'm an individual and a self that's different from you in some way. Like, I think that's probably fair. But how important is that? And should that become the basis of our ethos? That because of that, therefore what? Should I live, in a way that's out for myself and put my interests above yours. Even if there is a substantive or a non-substantive, but a conceptual notion of self, is that important? Or might it itself be an obstacle? Right? So sure, I can think of myself as a self, but should I? What good comes from that? Is it possible all evil comes from that? Right? And so I think there's a couple questions I want to tease apart, and then we'll move on here. But yeah, first, is there a self? What is a self? That sort of thing. But probably the more important for me is the ethical. And like I said, there's always the irreducibility of the ethical. You can't get away from it. How do you understand that? And what role does it play in your understanding of the world, your relationship to others, your goals, right, your dreams? And so I think I'll end there. I have a million other things we can talk about, but I hope that comes up in the Q&A. So thanks.
Okay. And up next is filmmaker Ann Kaneko.
Hi, y'all. I came here, or my journey to being here in this room, thank you all for having me, is that I had a conversation with Robin about burrowing owls. I'm a filmmaker. I'm not going to talk about my medium as it relates to the individual, but rather sort of what I've been following or what my interests, my questions have been as I've been making some film. So this is right over by the Ontario airport, and we were talking about burrowing owls and sort of how they relate to what's happening all around us. But I should say that this kind of interest in land, and I'll return to the burrowing owl later, but I should say that this interest in the land really comes from a film that I made before, which is called Manzanar Diverted, When Water Becomes Dust. And it looks at sort of the impacts that the city of Los Angeles has on Payahunadu, or also known as the Owens Valley. It's the Eastern Sierras. And this kind of relationship and the impacts of colonial powers in this valley, right? So Native Americans who were pushed out of the valley, the Numu and the Nua, Japanese Americans who are incarcerated there, and also ranchers and farmers who are pushed out of there. So you're like, well, what does this have to do with the individual? But I feel like Ryan's presentation is a great introduction to what I'm kind of sort of talk about. But, I think that through this film, I've really, come to know many Native Americans. I've come to, working with this relationship, or working with this community, I've come to really appreciate so many values and so many approaches to life that I have learned from, my Indigenous friends. And today, fittingly, is the day after Indigenous Peoples Day. But I myself, as someone who is, I'm Japanese American, my family is Buddhist, I think I grew up with a real appreciation for nature, and also perhaps this notion, this kind of skepticism about the self, since, I was always sort of taught not to put myself first. So although I'm not a Native American person, I feel like I have an affinity to the values and the approach that so many Native Americans have about valuing our lands, that there is no separation of people with nature. They are our relatives, that animals are to be respected and are relatives just as humans are, right? And that, water and land, they're not resources to be extracted, but rather they are they are our life sources. They are what makes our world what it is. So rather than me say these things, I want to share a clip from one of the main characters from my film. Her name is Kathy Bancroft, and she is the Tribal Preservation Officer in Lone Pine. And she's been working with, she works as a cultural, a monitor on Patsiata, which is also known as the Owens Lake. And the Owens Lake no longer, it was the third largest lake in California, but because of the Los Angeles Aqueduct, in 10 years, it was drained for the use of folks living in Los Angeles. And we're not talking about this recently. This is in the 1920s, right? So she's really sort of devoted her life to, preserving and remembering the stories that are on this land. So I want to just show this first clip.
My people, my ancestors, my grandparents have lived on this lake for thousands of years. It means something to all of us. It's where a lot of our ancestors are buried. And this lake was called Patsiata, which is fed by a whole bunch of streams and creeks and rivers. They used to talk about how green and the water and the birds and the animals that were all here, all of the plants. This was a really source of survival. In our recent history, it's important because of all the massacres that took place around it, the people that lost their lives. The bones of our ancestors are in that lake. Water, as it gathers from clear up north, comes down, and as it's coming down, it's gathering life. So even though they've drained the water, all of that power and life is still in that lake. A lot of people think, oh, we're out here for arrowheads, but everything is a cultural resource. The plants, the water, including all the artifacts that are left.
So I just wanted to share that because I think just the way she talks about these things really belies kind of her relationship, her relationality with, nature and these, the world around her, right? And in contrast, I want to show you another clip from the aqueduct manager, the LA aqueduct manager for the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, and sort of show his, the way he regards the lake and water. I feel like there's a real strong contrast.
When we have an event year like we've had this last year, next time, is there something that the city would do differently in terms of how to handle an abundance of water, too much water?
Is we had an extra about 250,000 acre foot that we didn't know what to do with. I couldn't send to LA because the aqueduct could only handle so much. So what was I going to do with that extra 250,000? It would have went to Owens Lake. People say, oh, well, that's great. Then you resolve an issue there. The problem with that is, if all that water went to Owens Lake, it would have risen the water level in the lake 7 foot, would have flooded and damaged $1.2 billion of infrastructure. So there would have been at least $400,000 of infrastructure that would have been damaged.
So apparently if it can't go down the aqueduct and somebody turn their tap on and drink it, then they consider it a waste.
There is a linearity of approach when you work with engineers. I personally at one point said to Mr. Yanada, stop, let's think about the Owens Valley. It's like a big basin. It could be your recharge basin. It could be where you keep the water underground like a reservoir, and then when you need it at a reasonable rate, you can use it. So it's transforming it from being like this industrial site where you put wells, that's mining, to working collaboratively with nature.
So I feel like it's kind of obvious from these two clips. You know, it's kind of an illustration of what Ryan was talking about in terms of the individual and, you know, how in Western societies, I mean, I think we all accept this notion that the world is for our taking, right? That we can extract as much water as we want, that, you know, we can continue to pipe these things, but we're faced with climate change right now. And so I feel like all of this behavior that's, you know, brought us to this moment is really, if we choose to face it, I feel like we need to take responsibility for what our actions have created, right? And so, you know, I think that part of the indigenous ethos is really that we don't take more than we need, right? That we value everything as if it is part of us, right? And so coming back to the burrowing owls, so these burrowing owls are like right next to the Ontario airport, and it's that's habitat, this is prime habitat area, but this area is going to be paved over to create a hotel and mall and the whole Inland Empire. I mean, I went to, you know, I actually came to Chino, to Chaffey College when I was in high school and took trigonometry. So it's like, I've seen this place change, and now what we see everywhere are warehouses and development. And so, again, it's this consumption, this desire for need and things that drives this engine to keep taking from our world. So this is basically what I've, you know, sort of brought up as a, you know, a consideration about the individual. And just a little plug, next slide, if you want to come to see the film, it's showing on Saturday at UC Riverside at 4:30, and one of the composers is actually going to be there to play the array and beta, which is used in the film. And we're also launching a little AR/VR 360 piece with it. But anyway.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. All right, last lap, and then Sergio will speak, and then it's going to be, he'll be up for Q&A. Let's give you a minute. All right, Sergio, take us home.
Okay. So there it is. So that's the idea that I wanted to present to you. Nothing that I will say to you is new. It's just maybe think of them as reminders of what we could do. And I thought about things that we could do as a more tangible way. So I want to give you things at the end. Anyway, the point that I will be raising is that we can disrupt, or maybe to say it this way, I am affirming what others are already doing in disrupting this supremacy of the self. And there's actually a name for it. In sociology, we have this idea called individualism that is considered one of the most unique American values It doesn't mean that other societies do not share that value. It's thanks to satellite TV and the internet, social media, relatively cheap travel, cultures diffuse, and a lot of the things that are, American, quote unquote American, right, you will see them in every other society and vice versa. So there is nothing, it's not like the United States monopolizes this value, this cultural value, but we're uniquely known for that. Anyway, so individualism is this, first of all, I want to talk about the sociologist that created this model, who he called the 10 primary American values, and at the top of the hierarchy was individualism. So it's this idea, and I'm quoting another sociologist, Peter Cayero, in his book, 2013, it was actually called The Myth of Individualism. In that, what he says is that, so by individualism, we mean this worldview where, first of all, we come to accept that every individual has 100% autonomy as a natural occurrence, very much like, we have tissue, we have two lungs and a heart, the same way autonomy is just a given. With that, we also have the power to, because we're independent entities, we're separated from society, is the belief, we're able to then do whatever we want as separate entities if we gain enough individual power to do what we want. So I was thinking about, that old thought where like someone can be thinking, I have a 1956 gas guzzler, and I don't really care about these, the consequences of my driving, the gas prices. After all, I have the resources to do what I want. So that's one of the, what I call dimensions of individualism, which is, again, a cultural value that we in sociology like our students to take, to see that is part of our culture. And by the way, when I say value, I'm referring to ideas that are socially shared in a society with respect to what is good, what is bad, what is desirable, what is not, what is moral, what is not. So that's kind of where I'm going with this. So it's a socially shared idea. It's not like doing anything. And so we have to enact in ways and practices those values. And so the example that I gave you, driving a gas guzzler, is an example of how I express my individuality. And so the other thing about this is that the other dimension is it's actually kind of like a political ideology that where those people that have more wealth and more power in our society, well, specifically in our society, it is in their best interest for all of us to 100% espouse and embrace that value of individuality or individualism, because they're the ones that are going to benefit from the increasing inequality. And for example, think that how people in middle and working classes will argue about, public institutions are corrupt. We don't need Social Security. We don't need public education. Let's just shrink it, right? Or why don't we just make everything a charter school? When in fact, 99% of the population benefits from public institutions, specifically public education. I wouldn't have been able to help out my daughter finish, now she's beginning the master's program at a UC if we didn't have public education. So of course, who benefits from public education? The rest of us, except for that small group of people. Anyway, so they benefit from the rest of us accepting that idea, which Karl Marx called false consciousness. Forgive me if I'm using this name. I know there's a lot, especially these days, mentioning this name is dangerous, right? So anyway, so Karl Marx called false consciousness, this awareness whereby the workers, he would say, aligned with the interests of those with capitalists. And so, for example, they would refuse to join unions because unions were corrupt. They take too much money away from you. They're communist, right? So the same way that false consciousness seeps through society. So I argue that individualism, that other dimension of individual being not just a value, but also the ideology by which the rest of us don't really reach out to others to seek out justice, that actually touches all of us in our society. Now I want to just briefly talk about two important sociologists that I thought I really liked their ideas that relate to how the self works within society. The first person is George Herbert Mead, who uses the metaphor, and I'll mention the other name when I get there. And so George Herbert Mead describes the process of how the self concept, or the self, individuality, how the individual rises from society, how we develop the ideas and thoughts and emotions that we have about who we are as men, women, and so on. And so he uses this metaphor of the pretending to be others, role playing. And so, and then he employed this kind of a framework where it goes from one stage to the other as we evolve ourselves. So we begin with imitation. Roughly, it ends around our toddler years, where we're just simply mimicking what's available to us in our environment, without really thinking or reflecting upon what it is that we're pretending to be. So I was thinking about, if you're a toddler and you're pretending to be a superhero, right? And because you're not reflecting about the consequences of being a superhero, you say, I'm Superman, and you jump off the window. That's the end of you. You know that, right? Anyway, so as toddlers, we don't reflect upon, we don't have empathy. And so as we evolve this self, we enter the stage of the play stage, in which he would say, this is roughly around the years when we begin school. And then it goes on. Basically, what happens here is that we now are reflecting on the roles that we're playing. By that, he means we're beginning to practice empathy. That is, I take a journey from me to you. Like, when we're communicating, in the sense that I am getting into your shoes. I am, the phrase, I want to know where you're coming from. That's what he's talking about. That's the empathy that we're practicing. And so when we're taking that journey from me to you, something really magical happens. We're bringing society into us. So in other words, the pronoun Americans, whether you claim it with shame or with pride, it doesn't matter. But when you say, I'm American, that's it. You have internalized, and we can skip that. The next screen, and just go to the next one. Yeah. So when we internalize that society, it's through that process, the imitation, play, and game. A game is the development, the final development of who we are. But the most important point before I get to C. Wright Mills is that when we develop our thoughts and emotions about who we are, and we are reflecting society, because we're taking that journey, remember, through the practice of empathy, what happens is there is no separation. It makes no sense to think of the self as being separate from society, because we continually seek out the nurturing of society to be meaningful, whether you're evil or good, and most of us are in between, I guess. So that's what's important about understanding the self as what I think in one of the emails I said, melting the self in society. So here comes this other guy. This character, C. Wright Mills, in sociology was a very interesting for many different reasons. But one of them is that he was writing in the late 50s, early 60s, times, the times of high turmoil, political, young people experimenting with drugs, in anti-war, you can see it, right? It's all over the media, right? Whenever you want to know about the 60s, you watch a movie. And so, anyway, so when he was writing this at the time, he was really interested in making sociology meaningful for the common people, because he thought, well, if I can show people that they can think sociologically, maybe they can, start reaching out and using the ideas in sociology to seek out justice. And what he was talking about is that, and he actually gave the name to this idea, the sociological imagination. And by that he meant, and he used these two dimensions. On the one hand, the private issues. So like, all the circumstances and situations in which you find that affect you in a very personal way, right? Whether they're good or bad, like graduating with a bachelor's degree right? That's a very personal thing, and you have accomplished something, so you should be proud, of course. Or on the other hand, if you're in a hardship situation, like, for example, being unemployed, when I was preparing for this, I was thinking, so what would be the first thing that would come to my mind if I was to experience, these are not wood, huh? Oh boy. If I was unemployed, and you know what it would be? Bank account. Because my bank account would determine where I'm going to be living next month. And the private, personal issues, and of course, they will affect the most intimate spaces in my life, including what we call the significant others, right? And then the other dimension is the public issues, which are the large-scale problems that affect most of us, if not all of us in society. And so, but the trick here is that when we frame public issues, they feel so distant, especially if you have not experienced, for example, unemployment. Like if you say, you see the word, the national unemployment rate, it feels so distant. Like the idea that I was saying about empathy, crickets, right? You can't really be empathetic. You can't get into the shoes of the unemployment rate. You know what I mean? And so that connection, what C. Wright Mills was saying, if we can make that connection between the intersection between the self and society, and that's what he meant by the sociological imagination, the ability that we can gain to understand that my private issues are affected by what goes on in my social environment. So in effect, I'm not alone. Whether I'm unemployed, I am housing insecure, whether I'm being discriminated. I love that the woman in the black woman in the white background, because the first thing that came to my mind was she's defying the institutions of society that were telling her. I'm not sure when she was doing her work. Was it in the 50s? No, that was all the way. That's the 80s. The 80s. Well, still, the discrimination continues. In the 50s and 60s, as you know, discrimination was legal. And so I can imagine that, right? But anyway, so this ability to see the individual in the context of society, and then we can go to the next screen. So this is what I want to give you. And again, this is not an original idea. I'm just affirming what millions of people out there, maybe yourself, you're doing it already, is to gain or to regain and to raise this social consciousness to think about my issues within the larger context. And so two practical things. Practicing empathy, and something I forgot to say earlier, just because we do really good at empathy, when we're communicating, because that's the whole process that George Herbert Mead was saying about gaining the ability to see myself in society. We practice empathy when we communicate with one another. And most people are really good. They're good listeners. They know where you're coming from, right? Just because we are very adept at empathy doesn't mean that we embed empathy as part of our, lifestyle, thinking about others, caring for others. So this is what I'm saying, if we could practice empathy in very practical ways. So here's my example that I thought. I think it was until Saturday, healthcare workers working for Kaiser were on strike. And so one thought that came to my mind was, I can imagine people, picking up their cell and going, damn, one of those days is my appointment. These people are disrupting. How inconvenient this is, right? That's precisely the lack of empathy that I'm talking about. And so if I can, say to myself and ask other people, well, I want to know firsthand, do I know someone that can explain to me why you take that radical step and going on strike? Because believe me, in the United States, joining a strike, being a member of a union is kind of a radical thing, Not that you get killed or anything, but in most countries, like in France, they don't care. They'll stop traffic, and they will, the airport will stop functioning. Here, we're a little different. But anyway, so, wanting to know, so tell me, where are you coming from? I want to know about all the conditions under which you are taking this step. And of course, seeking the facts. And if I can plug in National Public Radio, it's just about in my opinion, one of the most credible sources of news and information. Nothing like, articles in journals. But if you want to know the news, you can get the app from your on your phone. Just consider that. And then the other thing is practice solidarity. And it strikes me that solidarity is not a very common word in our language, in the English American language. And solidarity is pretty common in a lot of societies. I was watching the news the other day, and I already knew this. The Spanish-speaking network, television networks in the U.S., they call each other the equivalent to comrade, compañeros, and that's not something you do in American media. Just a little reflection, of that individualism, right? But anyway, solidarity, and I'm telling you this, and this is the last thing. So the range of choices in college campuses, and I see you are in the journey from going to college, and a lot of you will transfer to a Cal State or UC or maybe a big campus private university. The range of choices to join in and practice empathy and practice solidarity is huge. And I'm telling you, the college campus is one of the safest places to do just that. And the example that I have here is student clubs. So just think about it. There's a whole bunch of, you are an advisor of a student club. I advise another. Do you advise? You see? So take that step. Thank you.
That was beautiful. Oh, big round of applause for all of the panelists, please. So we'll transition. I'm supposed to stay close to this. We'll transition now to your questions. And Anya and Samantha, I don't mean to put you on the spot or anything, but do you guys want to come? You guys want to come up and start the line so that the questions come out? So that the questions come out in the video. If you want to ask a question, just make a line in the aisle, right? So we can have a line coming up and then a line going back. Come on up. Are you? You be the first. Groundbreaker. All right, Anya.
Okay. My question is, how do we push for action in social issues such as environmental issues, animal rights, without invading others' sense of self when sometimes science isn't even enough? Yeah.
So what you said, without invading?
Yeah, others people's sense of self.
The microphone down.
So how could we,
That's a good question. I'd have to think about it probably a bit more. I think there's often a threat to people's sense of self when you ask anything of them, right? That something they don't already believe or don't already want to do. And I think getting back to Sergio's comments about individualism as kind of an ethos or egoism as an ethos, I think asking anybody to do anything challenges some of that, right? Don't tell me what to do. We were talking about this interesting healthcare, I think in maybe your class, and we were talking about whether it's a right or not or whatever. And I had a couple of students that talked to me that said, hey, even if people have some right to health care, it's a good thing. I don't want to pay for it. Sure, I don't want someone dying in the streets in this sense of an ethical awareness that, which gets to empathy or compassion, that matters. But then it's invariably interpreted as a threat, right? But it's my money. They shouldn't die, but man, I want to go to McDonald's later, and another $50 ruins that, right? And so I think in some ways I do want a disruptive approach to this, or a consciousness revolution, as some call for, which I think is threatening, and I'm okay with that, I guess is what I want to say. I place a higher premium on these goals of bettering the world, being more inclusive, combating speciesism, sexism, racism. So for me, that's inherently disruptive and probably threatening to many people, but in the right way. Now, you can do it in a way that's more offensive, or maybe more direct, where you call them out in a way, or name call, or try to belittle them. So I don't think that's appropriate, but I do think, asking others to give a shit about others or to combat their sense of entitlement or individualism is threatening, but in the right way. So I would say I support it, but with kindness, the friendly revolutionary, right? I think there are ways to do it, but sometimes it doesn't work, and you have to strong arm. So I don't know. I don't hide from that, I guess. But good question.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Oh yeah.
I was just going to also say that, in my film, the communities that are represented in the film, they all find solidarity with each other through building a coalition. And I think that especially for communities who have suffered from particular prejudices or, adverse societal circumstances. I think that there's ways that people do come together, and I think that that's also, in terms of making larger changes, like that has to be recognized as a way forward.
Thank you so much. So my question might be kind of hard to answer. So,
Those are always the best.
well, I'm learning how to pin bugs for my semester project for our biology class. And I feel bad about killing the bugs, but my teacher said that I shouldn't because you learn.
Who's that?
You, Sarah.
Because she said that I can learn a new skill that will help save animals in the future. But, I mean, I'm not technically going into that field, so I don't know, like, how much I learned from the bugs matters, per se, in that part. But I was talking to my mom about it because my mom doesn't care about killing bugs, and there's other people in the room that'll, like, step on a spider, they don't care. So where is the line between what you're allowed to kill and what you're not? Because my mom's like, what if there's termites, like, destroying your house? You're just going to let them destroy your house, or you kill the termites? Like, so where is the line, like, we kill animals to eat the food, like cows, pigs, but then people feel bad about killing dogs and cats? So, like, where's the line of what you should and should not kill an animal?
I'll go second. I have a brief comment, but go.
Okay.
Third.
I think that is the question. I think as we become more aware of the environment that we exist in, those questions become more and more important for us to understand. We know that the bug that you killed has a unique piece of DNA that's probably never been replicated in the world's history. How do we value that? Or do we value that? Or does it mean anything in terms of the context of the natural world or in terms of the context of our world? That's absolutely where you want to be.
Yeah, so in ethics, I mean, there's a few questions that you raised that involve sort of a few aspects of the question that involve different theoretical kind of frameworks or practical frameworks. So the big one is just moral community, right? How do we define our moral community? Who or what counts? This, again, what individuals or potential selves count in that community, and to what degree? It doesn't have to be equal, right? You might say, well, I place all humans here, and then maybe you have some great chain of being type thing where primates and maybe some pod animals or cetaceans all the way down to, whatever, microorganisms. I'm challenging us to think maybe a bit differently about that, right? That the interconnectedness of reality and this dependent arising of all reality means we're intimately interconnected in a way that, I mean, you see this with like the threat to bee populations, right? Like could ruin, agriculture for the world. And so I think, valuing all elements of nature, I think for me is a starting point. But tough decisions have to be made, right? Research or experiments for curing cancer or HIV/AIDS, or even like you said, for human knowledge that might lead to other great benefits, we pin bugs or do whatever. I'd be curious what these great benefits are, but I'm sure they're there, is all I'm saying. And I think those are tough decisions. I think that's something I want us to think about, right? How we define a moral community. If we notice our own hypocrisies along the way, like you said, we might privilege dogs, but then we'll eat a pork sandwich, right? And I think that's fairly ethically incoherent that happens, and I think you're pointing that out. And so I don't have an answer for that. I think I want to challenge the framework of this great chain of being notion that there's sort of lesser beings that matter less, or that matter, or that aren't ethically as significant, but recognizing that we all have to have that discussion at some point, and that there's no solution in which there's no suffering. I think this, I support this Buddhist utopia, the cessation of suffering, but realize as long as there are beings capable of suffering and beings capable of inflicting suffering, that's unavoidable. Now, we can avoid it to a certain degree, and so, but I don't have an answer for you in terms of where that line is, or even if there is a line, what overrides that line. Right? So we might even say self-defense would override the line of humans suffering mattering, right? Maybe not. Some radical pacifism is an option, but I would say it's probably one of the more rich, ethically and philosophically and personally, questions you can ever ask. Who or what matters in the ethical community, how you define the ethical community, and how do you place those entities or individuals in relationship to each other, or do you have a more holistic view that tries to break down those barriers between individuals or the part-whole relationship of reality and what matters. So I don't have an answer. I have more problems and questions for you. But I think pondering those can be one of the richer exercises you can do.
That's why I said it was a hard to answer question,
Yeah,
because I know it's like there's a line, but it's blurry. So I don't know.
And for many, it's like something like sentience. I'll say that's a common one, right? So if you're capable of experiencing pleasure, pain, that at least is a minimal attribute to be entered into the moral community. And I think that's a fair starting point. I go much further than that. But that might be one starting point that might make sense.
Yeah.
If something can suffer, don't make it suffer unless you have to.
I'll say one other thing in the defense of identifying bugs.
I need this part, yeah.
There was a wise saying that the beginning of wisdom is getting things by their right name. And without being able to have that capacity to identify a bug, an insect, a spider, we lose the ability of telling what's different, what's unique, what's special. And so that's a balance that needs to be considered as well.
So just to make it more confusing.
I'll say one more thing. But at the same time, I would say that the idea of knowledge is a very Western idea, because it's this idea of control as well, and that we can control something if we think we know what it is. But how can we know, really? So there's something else to think about.
Yeah, so some of the things that I've been thinking about as we've been talking is like challenging some of these ideas a little bit. And I'm thinking about Citizens United, right? Like the Supreme Court case that granted personal rights to corporations, right? That is the biggest like crock of shit that I've ever heard in the world. And how many individual rights were then infringed based on granting personhood to something like a corporation. In addition to that, though, but now there are activists that have taken that same structure and have fought for personal rights for things like rivers or natural formations. So there's something about this question of even beyond sentience, right? That has to do with rights, like the legal system. How is it actually filtered through the system that we are forced to live within? So I could imagine a world in which your insects are granted personal rights through some kind of court case or something. And just the kind of slippery problems that brings up in all sorts of things. That's it. I just kind of wanted to enter that into the room because I think it's like it's foundational to the way, to a lot of the problems that we're dealing with right now, but maybe also suggests paths forward.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. Next question, come on up.
So first I wanted to thank all of the presenters for your thoughtful contributions to this topic. I think it definitely caused a knee-jerk reaction in me that brought me up here to ask a question, so I think it was successful in that way, and really appreciated the variety of approaches to this. But the idea of the illusion of individuality, I was wondering, is individuality an illusion, or are we talking about scale and granularity? We can have an individual gold atom, we can have a gold bar, we can have a pile of gold bars, and then we can have a pile of gold bars sitting next to another pile of gold bars, and each one of those in their own scale is an individual thing, and we can extrapolate in both directions almost infinitely. But when we look at the level that we're trying to discover, we see that thing as the individual. So, I guess, is it more important to break the illusion of individuality, or is it more important to see the continuum that the individual exists within?
Jump on it again, sorry. Don't want to hog the time. But yeah, so I think you said kind of what I was getting at, right? That it's an illusion in the sense of it's a fiction or it's a framework. Doesn't mean it's wrong, or that it's bad even, but it's a story we tell about kind of the level of which we're analyzing. Think of like even instrumentation in the sciences or something, right? The microscope, the telescope continuum or something. And so we do that with reality all the time, and it has to do with our perceptual apparatus, right? And then our conceptual apparatus that's built upon that. What can we perceive and how do we categorize it? Our need to do taxonomy here, getting back to the entomology point. And so, yeah, I don't think it's wrong to do that. And like I said, we experience something as individuals, ourselves individuals, and we look at the world and we can say there's an individual, you said pebble, rock, quarry, ecosystem. I think that's fine. I think in the history of philosophy, though, there's an obsession with finding a substantive self that is some rock bottom foundational thing, a thing in the world. I think that's an illusion. And that quest in pursuing that illusion, I think, has led to a lot of great harm.
The discrete instance of time and space that I inhabit is not a reality of individuality.
I'm fine with saying that. I'm saying, or seeing that as a way of understanding our own experience. I think, and even the language, Robin got to this, right? We say things like self or my, and the pronoun game, which is true. We are experiencers in the world, and we inhabit, you said, a place in space and time and history, and I think that's fine. And we should have language that does justice to that, in the way that my experiences are in some ways different from and more located in me than your experiences are, or than your experiences are for me, and vice versa. I think that's all fine. I'm just pointing at the reality that there are ethical consequences and others in focusing on the effort to find that substantive self and venerate it, or increase its significance. So I'm just pointing out that in the history of philosophy, that's just been a major project, right? Think of the self project, even consciousness project, and I want to problematize that, but not problematize the unavoidable reality of carving up the world in certain ways and having part-whole relationships and individuals all, as we go up that part-whole thing. So I don't think there's any problem with that. The problem is seizing on it, defining ourselves as something over and above often other things, and often even other people, right? So that's what I'm getting with the class and race and gendered aspects of finding an immaterial self or a substantive self. I think there's an obsession with that is a problematic inheritance that plagues us all. And I can separate that from this broader, maybe taxonomic individualism where we want to divide things. I think that's okay. But notice the conceptual linkages there. You look at someone like Wittgenstein or Gadamer, and they look at these connections between these sort of frameworks, and you realize, there is some overlap there, and wow, that need in me to divide up the world, and well, wow. We have nation states and we have wars going on right now, and there's an urge inside all of us that I think is revealed or evidenced in those endeavors. That's also part of the philosophical quest, maybe fool's errand, of finding the self. And so I just want to connect those in a way, but grant that I think the one's less problematic, but it's not entirely conceptually unrelated to the other, right? So yeah, I want to carve out a space. I'm okay with that, probably.
There's a biological perspective too. I'm wondering if you were going to jump in on that, Mark. I can. I've got some stuff I'm dying to say, but I'm not a panelist. I don't want to sure you are.
Moderator's privilege, you can do it.
Yeah.
Oh, is that right? Yeah. I've never done this. I've never been a moderator before. So I think it's a both and. And the reason is that, and I think your question is really an elegant one. It's certainly one that I've grappled with a lot too, because if I go backwards from sponges, there are unicellular organisms called, and organisms as in the cells are autonomous, like what Mark was talking about, choanoflagellates they're called. And when they divide, to reproduce, you'll have a second choanoflagellate, and sometimes they stay together and they aggregate, right? And then sometimes the aggregations will have some specialization and some division of labor. And at what point, instead of having an aggregate, do you now have a colony, right? Because they're interdependent, even though each of them could split off individually and form another aggregate, another colony. But at some point, you get to a level of specialization, and you see this throughout life. You see this in plants, you see this in animals, you see this in fungi, you see it in subcellular life, where you get to a scale, as you said, where you get to a scale where you have a new level of complexity. And this is a frontier in biology, actually, is understanding the evolution of complexity both genetically and structurally. So both geneticists and physicists are working on this, like how complexity scales, because it appears, at least to my naive eye, because like I don't understand most of those papers. I got to tell you, it's like whoa. So I read the abstracts, but to my naive eye, it appears to me that functioning living systems, not just like arbitrary, like how big is the lump, of gold that we're talking about, but functionally living systems scale all the way up, perhaps even to the biosphere, like the planet, right? And I'll say that publicly without embarrassment, which not because it's quote unquote true, but because it certainly appears to me that that may be plausible. Go ahead.
Just a general point about your question and the other questions is that isn't it saying something that at this point in time we're allowed to ask questions like you're asking, and these questions are on everybody's mind. Climate change, what does it mean to be me? How am I viewed in society? It's like that says something about the condition of the world and kind of our idea of how precarious things are right now.
Just one small contribution. I would also add that there is nothing wrong with denigrating what makes a culture in a society, because that's, after all, is the story of that society. Individualism, for example. There's nothing wrong about acknowledging one's individual, for example, accomplishment. I gave the example of earning a degree in college, particularly for those groups that tend to be marginalized in society. Acknowledging their contributions, right? Those are individual contributions, because it's not like everybody in that, for example, ethnic group, did this. It's one person within. So the acknowledgement of individuality. The other, what I see that's dangerous is when the value individuality or the illusion of individuality becomes the ideology by which those that have greater power and wealth oppress the rest of society. That's what's wrong. Anyway, that's...
Just real briefly, Alex, you're up next. But briefly, it's really, really important to acknowledge that we are at 12:30, and so we were, supposed to wrap up at 12:20. Some folks, as a matter of fact, Brody's meeting a class at 12:30, so he's actually a little late for class. So we need to we don't have to wrap up, we can keep going, but we just need to respect people's time if they need to be someplace else. So could we please give the panelists a huge hand of, and if panelists need to split, and if you need to split, and if you want to stay, are you guys okay with? Okay, yeah. I know we have one more question for sure.
Hello. So I suppose when I first walked in here, I thought I had, at least for humans, because for other organisms besides humans, the idea of an identity, if one exists at all or not, is something I don't know how to define. But for humans, at least, I originally thought that the self, or at least somewhat of a definition that I could apply, is sort of the experiences a person has and the thoughts that they tend to have, whether it's regarding those experiences or otherwise. But as I sort of started to watch through the presentations, it's like, oh, well, your thoughts weren't originally your own, perhaps. They could have been not necessarily like implanted, but sort of supplied by your parents or by your environment. Even your experiences, yes, they're unique. Like, not everyone has experienced everything all the time, but there are undoubtedly other people who have experienced something, and it doesn't have to be the same. But then that also implies there's also like a slope of like, where do you draw the line? And so I sort of thought about this, and then I remembered back to the presentation regarding art, where it's like, oh, every artist places a part of themselves within it, or something like that. And my question was, what are your thoughts in regards to the interpretations a person has? Would they be given like the same sort of meaning as an experience, where yes, not everyone experiences the same thing, but different types of people can interpret the same thing, and so it's sort of like that? Or does something a person experiences and how they relate that experience to themselves change perspective as well? Sorry, it's kind of a hard question.
Yeah, his question in philosophy of perception and this other area just called hermeneutics, which is interpretation, right? Whatever. I mentioned Gadamer, so I'll just give his a quick model. And it's basically that we all, every perceiving being, right, and maybe we can include perceiving animals that have some capacity for this, maybe even more than that, but we come to every encounter, hermeneutical encounter, with an object, with a text, with a person, with something in our environment, with all that we are, which is mostly stuff, right, programmed into us genetically and socially, whatever, and that thing has all of its stuff behind it, and it's like this Venn diagram. The term he uses is horizons. So my horizons, your horizons, the art, the object in art, the object maybe hidden in the art, and at each time there's sort of a creative enterprise there, right? Every time I see art and you see the same piece of art, we're saying it's the same. We could even debate whether it's really the same piece at any given moment. But we create something. We create meaning, right? We create something, and that it's based on who you are, what you bring to the table, what that is in some ways, and other things that can even environmentally, other things that are now fusing with your horizons. So the fusion of horizons is this model for the creation of meaning, or the hermeneutical exchange of meaning. And so, yeah, I don't privilege any particular, perceiver or horizon or any interpretation. I think it's always a subjective enterprise at every time, and it's beautiful. I think there's a metaphor that's really creative and existential. Like, I'm creating meaning every day, you're creating meaning every day with every exchange, with every text, with every object, with every person, with every part of. So I don't know if that's exactly what you're getting at, but I think that, yeah, we are all, I wouldn't say entitled to, but we all are invariably doing that. And that's one of the beautiful things about being a perceiver in the world, right?
Yeah, that's what I was going for. Because, for example, I'm a Christian, so it's biggest religion in the world currently, and obviously it's as the biggest religion, it's not something that's particularly unique. I guess like more than half of the world, or I forget the numbers, but a large percentage.
2-point-something billion.
2-point-something billion. So definitely not half, but there are a lot of people who are also Christian, also experience that in different ways. My family isn't the most religious per se, but they're still Christians, right? And then there are others that are basically, I don't want to say zealots or implying sort of negative connotation, but they follow the doctrines within the Bible, or even if in the different religion, faithfully. So I was wondering that, because obviously a lot of people experience religion in their own way, and they all differ, but the interpretation people pull from them was somewhat different. So that was my question. But yeah, you answered it. Thank you.
Yeah, the same thing there, right? That we all come to our religious experiences and each moment of that in our own ways, even our own families. We may not share all the doctrines and beliefs of our parents, of our siblings. That's another evolutionary journey in the creation of meaning. So, yeah, fair. Good.
Thank you so much, Alex.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, and I think that was the wrap-up question, unless anybody has anything else. All right. Sent, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. And yeah, and applause. Oh man, that was amazing. Beautiful. Have a beautiful rest of your day, everybody.